This is Show Up as a Leader, a show from People Forward Network, helping you maximize your positive impact on the world by becoming your best, fully authentic self.
Hey everyone. I just have to tell you, I think you're going to have so much fun listening to kind of a repeat geek out session with myself and my dear friend, Jaime Taets. Jaime was on a couple of years ago when her first book came out, You Are Here. She is the Chief Vision Officer at Keystone Group International, and she has a fairly newer book out that came out several months ago called The Culture Climb. And she works with all kinds of organizations working on strategy, working on culture, leadership, a lot of similarities in our work. And we had such a fun and insightful conversation talking about the critical role of culture and looking at it from this big macro, maybe unattainable, overwhelming level to breaking it down to really simple, tangible things that you can do to tend to what she calls the culture in your own backyard. Whether you are a formal people leader or you are an informal leader, we talk about how you can develop your influential power and how, at the end of the day, we can look at igniting the performance in our people. And she talks about some key indicators that there might be culture issues at play, talk about who is actually responsible for culture in organizations. We talk about the critical importance of our language and how we can ask some very specific questions, tangible things you can take away from this conversation. So have a notepad handy where you have some language that ignites curiosity versus language that shows we're posturing or have a hidden agenda. Just lots and lots and lots of good nuggets. You're going to want to take notes. You're going to probably want to listen to this one more than once. I hope you get as much out of this conversation and have as much fun listening to it as we had having it. All right, Jaime, my sister from another mister, we are back for a repeat conversation. I'm so excited.
I know, and everyone else just gets to listen.
It's like you're just being welcomed into our party, and it's totally fine. Yes, well, we had so much fun the first time. So I think our first podcast conversation that we did for my show was a couple years ago, and that was when your first book came out, You Are Here. And it's been a hot minute since your second book, well, last year came out, The Culture Climb. And so I was like, we have to have you back on. We have to have a jam session around culture. We've got to talk about leadership because it's just crazy right now. And so here we are. So welcome back, my friend.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. So I'm just going to dive right in because you say something that is profound and should be common sense, but I just feel like we need to start right there. And you talk about in your book, I highlighted this. I'm like, yep, like mic drop. Most business problems are actually people problems. Talk about that. Why do you say that and what are you seeing?
Well, this actually came out of a conversation with a long-term manufacturing client that we've worked with for years and years and years. And we got to annual planning one year, and with end of the day, and the COO, right, president, is looking at the list of things, and he goes, "Do you realize every single one of our problems is just a people problem?" And he's staring at the wall of everything we just came up with, and I'm like, "Yeah." And I said, "Don't you realize that we haven't been on a strategic planning, kind of, even though that's what you think it is, it's leadership development. It's people development. That's what we're doing in the room is we're making the leaders better so that the people can come along, right? The human energy can flow better. But most of what we deal with, the breakdowns, is not we don't know the strategy. We don't know how our products or services should be better. It's that we don't know how to ignite the performance, right? And the power of the people that we have on our team. That's the biggest gap most organizations have.
Oh, 100%. Like they've got these wonderful plans or they've got these processes or these new things. And it's like, and who has to implement them? People. Who has to lead them? People.
And I think some leaders, when they read that, they misconstrue it as like, "Oh, yeah, the people. They don't wanna work. They don't wanna work hard. That's not what I'm saying in that statement. If you actually read it, what I am saying is we have not ignited the performance in the people. It's not their fault, it's leadership's fault, right? We aren't doing what we need to do to therefore create the business results we're looking for.
You know what's so fun? I'm so glad that you clarified that because if I had a dollar for every time I've heard a leader say, "Oh, leadership would be so easy if I didn't have to deal with people." It's like, "Oh my god." Like, no, 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 right? You have a privilege of igniting, right, the performance in people. You have a privilege of leading other people, and it's not for everybody to be a formal leader because I think, you and I both think everyone can be a leader, but I think that's super critical, and I think so often we take this mechanistic view that, oh, we're going to put in this process and people are just supposed to do this, or if I say it this way, they're going to do that, as if people are these predictable controllable machines, rather than, no, we're complex, messy, thinking, feeling beings. And that's what's wonderful about humans, and that also is what makes things challenging, because we have to think differently about how we go about business, because we are working with people, not robots.
And for anybody who has kids, right? I'll tell an executive team, like, how many times how often can you tell your kid once and they fully understand the breadth of what you need them to do and they do it? And then they do it the next time? Never. But never, right? So humans are that way. Like, you're on mile 23 of the marathon and I'm at the start line as your employee and I haven't tied my shoes yet. But you expect me to understand what mile 23 looks like? I haven't been on the journey you've been on. I haven't had all the conversations you've had, and you have to bring me along in that journey. That's your job as a leader. Not just turn around and be like, "What the hell? She's so stupid. Why is she back at the start line?" Because nobody's told me what race we're racing, right? Or where I'm supposed to go. And I think leaders forget that because we get so far ahead of the team, we forget we've got to bring them along at a pace so that they can get to where, and we need to stay ahead of them. That's our job. We need to be out in front, but we have to bring them along with us.
100%. I love that analogy. So, you and I could both geek out on culture and leadership all day, and I know we're going to continue geeking out in this conversation, but there's some things that you talk about in the culture climb, where you talk about some indicators that cultural issues are operating behind the scenes and preventing people from doing their best work. Because I think a lot of times we do jump to either wanting to blame people or blame a process or blame something else, but when we recognize that culture is that underlying current of kind of everything, what are some of those indicators for people listening that might say, oh gosh, I wonder if we might have some culture issues to some degree that are preventing our people from, right, being able to ignite performance, from do their best?
I'll give you a big one, but a simple one is you're not hitting your numbers. And I don't just mean revenue and profit numbers. I mean operational efficiencies, right? Utilization, whatever your company, because all companies kind of measure performance. You're not hitting your performance numbers. You're not hitting your revenue per employee, which some companies, actually that helps them understand how efficiently they're running. That's a cultural issue. It's not a strategy issue at that point. People say, like, should we be doing like strategy for our culture? Like, how do we get culture into our strategy? And my answer is you develop your strategy and then you develop your plan, two very different things. Just to be clear, your strategy is longer term. Where are we going? Your plan is what do we need to do this year? When you're developing that, cultural considerations, you should be doing a cultural risk assessment for every single one of the things you're planning to do in your strategy. It's not a totally different list of things. Like, let's develop a fund committee. That's not what we're talking about. But it's not a separate initiative. It's a when we go from X to Y, or when we enter that new market, or we divest of that part of our business, or whatever our big strategic items are, what impact will that have on our culture? Because it will. And what are we doing about that proactively as part of this strategic initiative? So stop thinking of culture as this other list of things that are fun and team building. And those are great. When you really impact your culture is when you bring it into your strategy, not have it be a separate thing.
I feel like in so many industries right now, there is a bit of shrinking, right, with mergers and acquisitions. And I've seen it, and I'm sure you've seen this too, go both ways, where on one hand, a company is actually being very thoughtful about the cultural implications. And as they are vetting either selling to somebody, or they're vetting, buying a company to bring into their portfolio, they are very closely looking at the culture and looking at what is the impact and how do we preserve what we have that is good, because they get it and they care about it and they've done a lot of work and they don't want that to go out the window because of a bad decision of merging or acquiring. And I've also seen on the flip side where they don't think about it, or they think it's going to be fine and they're not actually creating deliberate practices to care for it. And now there's a big disconnect of what's happening at the bigger company, global organization level, and the individual, let's say, geographical offices, and stuff's blowing up in their face because of it.
And the metrics would tell them that. Your performance metrics at those other levels would tell them they are impacting their business results by not considering culture. The study, I mean, you and I both, we could spout studies and data. It's there. So if there's a business leader listening that is like, yeah, I don't know yet if culture is important and we should be thinking about it, like just go search. You don't have to listen to us. Go look it up. I mean, positive cultures outperform the S&P 500 index by 4 to 5 times. So if you don't think there's a tie to business results, you're living under a rock. Like this is now not a nice to have, it's an absolute must have for organizations. And that's why instead of trying to just be the culture people, which we could go out to the market and just speak about culture, we're the we're the strategy and growth people that talk about if you don't consider culture, there won't be a strategy and growth. You won't get to where you want to get to. It's a very different way to look at it. You have to start thinking at a more strategic level.
100%. And I think where I've seen some organizations, the intention is good. Right, they have really good intentions, and they're renaming, for example, their HR departments, the people and culture department, or so there's some proactive, like some good movement happening there. But then it turns into, so this department or this leader or this area is somehow now solely responsible for culture. Newsflash, doesn't work that way. Or, so I don't care if you have a chief culture officer or you have a department around it. To your point, we always say culture is everybody's responsibility, and leaders have the biggest role because of the influence they have. So if leaders at all level aren't embodying your purpose and your values and what you want for your culture, and if the people in charge of creating the strategy and operationalizing the strategy aren't considering the cultural implications and aren't modeling that and aren't connecting the dots, to your point, for people, so they, when you said, oh, I'm at mile, they're at mile 23, and employees are still tying their shoes. If we're not intentional about how do we keep connecting the dots, it's not going to work.
Right. And there's so many things here, but like culture's the leader's choice. So I'll give you a perfect example. So Fortune 50 company here in town, who shall remain nameless, I'm speaking at one of their big leadership events, and they want to talk about culture because it's important. All their leaders, 1,600 leaders from all over the world, like come in. And I'm having these sessions with them, and they're like, they send me their culture leadership practices, right? I love you, all of you corporate people. I've been there, but you just create really, really fancy stuff that leaders don't know how to do anything with. And this is what it was. It's really well thought out. It's like Harvard MBA level stuff because of the size of the company. And I had a call with them. I said, I don't know if I'm the right speaker for this event because what you put on those, sheets of paper, like that is really, really big stuff. And I'm like, what I want to bring it down to is simple. What does a leader need to do walking out of the room? Not what do they need to do for the next 10 years to shift the culture? What are the simple practices that will start to create momentum? And they're like, no, that's exactly what we need you to talk about because this isn't having the impact we need it to have because we don't know how to take it from these big, big ideas to like day to day, human to human. We need our leaders to be human first. No amount of PowerPoint slides and fancy strategies around culture are going to do it if we're not teaching our leaders to be human. Don't overcomplicate it out of the gate. And I also don't think a Fortune 500 size company, we are never going to come in and work at culture at the top. We're going to work divisionally, departmentally, and with every team. Because even if there's one division or one department that wants to be better, we can help them be better and help their culture, even if we can't impact the other 40,000 employees at the company. But we can make that environment better for their employees. And that's where we need leaders to start thinking your own backyard first.
And so, have you ever been in an organization that, my gosh, like there's a whole lot of toxicity and nonsense going on, but people are like, but my team is awesome, and I feel like I'm in a protective bubble and it's great. Well, that's because that is primarily created and nurtured by that leader, to your point. And so, yeah, so I love that, because I do think that we hear so often leaders almost get a defeatist mentality or defeatist attitude of, well, I can't because I don't have the influence, or they won't listen to me, or I feel, 10 steps removed from, the exec team or whatever it is. And to your point, it's like, no, you can make a difference right here, right now in your own backyard, to use your words, your own team. And what does that look like? And how do you build from there? And it's like grassroots organizing 101. You start one team at a time and you grow, and then it feels doable. It feels tangible, and it's not so nebulous and overwhelming.
Well, and that's how we wrote the book. We didn't write the book for, a Harvard MBA, OE, organizational effectiveness leader, right? Or an HR leader. We wrote it for the average business leader because we wanted it to be simple and practical enough that, I get asked all the time, well, it's so big. Where do I start? I'm like, go download the culture vision document and go have a meeting with your team and ask them what you think the vision of your culture in your team is. And you will see the energy change. You will see them engage in a different way, right? That in and of itself is valuable. Just start there. Like, don't overcomplicate it, but they're going to feel heard. They're going to feel like they're part of like creating the answer. Like, if I want this to be a good place to work, it's also not my leader's job to the only job. It's my job. How I think, act, and interact with everybody on my team, I have a part in that, right? As a part of a team. And we give the analogy of, insert any big company. If someone asks you, what's it like to work at Target, Cargill, General Mills? What is the answer? The answer is always it depends. It depends on what area. It depends on the leader that you work for, right? Those big companies can't control that and it's perfect everywhere. But what they can do is invest in the leaders so the leaders are creating those cultures, right? That are tied back to their foundation and their values. But that's what's going to make the difference in your employment brand and right your performance is getting the leaders ready to drive that level of culture.
Absolutely, absolutely. I just wrapped up this morning doing some culture-based work, team-based work that we do with one of our groups. And we started this out, last summer and wrapped up today. And we started this whole thing by saying, Here's the deal. Every single one of you on this team don't have to have a formal leadership role, has a choice each and every day. Are you going to show up as a culture contributor or a culture contaminator?"
Well, and once the team what you're doing, once the team is engaged, then they can hold each other accountable to like, you're not showing up in the way we just said, right? That we wanted our culture to be. And again, that the leader's job is to drive that conversation and make sure people are adhering to what the team decides, right? And getting people out if they're not. But it's not all on the leader either. This is where we need to meet in the middle. Is the employees also need to say, I'm going to do what I can do to make this a better place.
And the other thing, I'd be curious your thoughts about this, because there's so much synergy in our work. But when you think about, when we talk about developing leaders, and you talk about this in your book, which I love, there's an important distinction, but not between, who's a formal leader because they have additional responsibility because of the influence they have, but people development, because for so long we've ignored developing anyone that doesn't have a formal leadership role or isn't quote unquote high potential. But we can't afford to do that anymore. Like, all the data shows we have to start to equip everybody to show up as a leader.
Right. And everyone has to be resilient in this environment we are operating in, right? There's all these skills that we need to develop. And we talk a lot, and I'm sure this, you said the word, so it's probably in your repertoire too, is hierarchical power versus influential power, right? We all have influential power. It doesn't matter if you're a hierarchical leader or not. How are we developing that in people? And that means as a soccer coach, as a member of the PTA, and in your organization, right? Like, are you developing that influential power, that emotional intelligence to challenge with respect, right? To really push boundaries when needed or bring ideas to the table or take initiative, right? And do something that you think or start a conversation that you think is something that would benefit the team. So many organizations have actually done a disservice to their people because we've put them in boxes and said, kind of stay in that instead of allowing them to have influence in the right way and coaching them through that. And we've created the issue in corporate America. I mean, we've allowed it to kind of permeate, but we also haven't given them the tool sets on how to do that respectfully. Right. So we just collide personalities just constantly because we're not teaching and modeling. I think modeling is a big word here. Leaders need to model that in their own way so that someone else says, okay, I kind of see how they navigated that situation. right? Or that conversation. We're doing that all the time as leaders. And what kind of modeling are we doing? We should probably be paying attention to that.
And I love your distinction between, hierarchical power and, influential power. Because I think power can get such a bad rap, but, power is about having impact, and power is about, that reach, and it's power with versus power over, if I use, Brene Brown's language. So what are some things, if you think about, if we are going to help broaden people's ability to show up as a leader and help develop influential power, what's something tangible that you would invite our listeners to think about that could start to grow or strengthen their influential power, or they could bring back to their teams if they're listening and they're a formal leader?
I think it's start asking different questions. It seems very simple, so I'll kind of explain it. But like use tools that you have, right? Or tools that we have, like start driving maybe different conversations, not because you know the answer, but because you want to drive the conversation. I think curiosity is such an undervalued skill set. And curiosity without posturing, right? Just true curiosity about what if or how could we, right? Start asking these questions where it's not about I think or I want or our language is so important in how we ask questions and how people perceive why we're asking the question, right? And how they engage in that conversation. I think of as teams, if we just started asking better questions and using language more effectively, we could solve a lot of problems that we're dealing with, right? It would open up our minds to like, I'm so close to it. I wasn't thinking about it that way. But when you asked me that question, right, I pulled back and I'm like, yeah, you're right. That is not effective the way we're doing it today, but not in an intrusive way where I'm calling you out. Because I think that's where a lot of environments go wrong is we ask questions with the wrong language and it just deteriorates the conversation from the very beginning, right? People's minds close and the best ideas aren't coming out because we're not kind of keeping our minds open based on how we're using the language. So there's a great book. Literally, the guy's not like famous or anything, but Degrees of Strength. And it's all about questioning. So they tell you about like even switching a small word in a question makes it a degree of strength question versus a degree of weakness and can fundamentally shift how you interact, right, with your team, whether you're on the team or you're the leader. So I think a lot of is self-awareness on how we're showing up and how we're being curious and the language we're using.
I think that is so important because language does matter hugely, and people who, brush it off like, no, it makes a big difference. And I also really appreciate your distinction between, what is that language that we use that really truly does open up curiosity versus posturing or whatnot. Because here's the thing is being curious is also extremely vulnerable, because if I am going in truly to be curious versus posturing, if I am going in trying to open up a dialogue, but I don't know the answer, there's a chance that I might ask a question that's I open up a can of worms and I don't know what to deal with. I might open up a can of worms and stuff comes out and I now suddenly don't know the answer, or I find out I'm wrong. And that is really unsettling for so many people. And so they'd rather just not ask the question, or they go in asking a leading question to already answer it versus to truly open dialogue, because that fear of I don't know what this could create, what this could open up, what ripple effect this might have. And I don't want to fill in the blank, look bad, look stupid, look silly, look incompetent. And so I'm just not going to go there. But that's what we need to have if we're gonna uncover, like you talk about not mowing dandelions. We're gonna talk about that in a second. But if you're not gonna mow dandelions and you're gonna find out the root cause, if you're going to actually grow, if you're gonna innovate, if you're gonna figure out how to get past a sticking point, you can't do that without curiosity.
Right. And we can tell, right? So we come into organizations, even from a strategy standpoint. I can almost immediately, within a half day of working with a team that we might work with for years after that, tell you where if they have a strong culture or not, just based on if I ask a question and two leaders look at each other, I can tell they've already had the conversation and they just haven't had the guts to ask that conversation, right? To ask that question. And I had to come in from the outside and ask it. And you have those moments of like, that's a cultural aspect. That's a really good key in as a leader. If people aren't asking you really, really good, curious questions, I will tell you, your culture is not as strong as it could be. There's an easy indicator for you, right? Because if your culture is strong, people are asking all the dumb questions. I don't have to come in and ask the dumb questions because they're already asking them. And they don't care if it's dumb because it's making somebody think differently about something that happened last week. And it's like, oh, you know what? That might be an indicator of a bigger problem. Or we might be, it's that whole innovation is such a buzzword, but it just comes from asking different questions and shifting our thinking from the same thinking we used to create the issue in the first place.
So what are some other, indicators, you can go either way, that, like, someone maybe your culture's not as strong as it could be, or you can answer it the way of what are some other indicators that maybe your culture is strong and you wanna keep nurturing that?
I think one thing, especially for a leader at the top, is collaboration across departments, across divisions. If you're seeing them come together on their own without, right, upper level having to say, "Hey, the 2 of you work together to solve this customer issue or solve that." If you're seeing them come together on their own, that's a huge factor of culture, right? That's a huge collaboration is one of the kind of foundational elements. If you're feeling like your, communication right at the top, whether that's your vision or just kind of is getting through the organization, that tells you your culture is probably pretty strong. If it's not, you probably have cultural issues at some point. And it doesn't mean people are showing up and hate each other. I think a lot of leaders think that the culture is going to be like, if there's problems with the culture, it's going to be in your face. It's not. It's silent. It's the things that aren't being said. It's the conversations that aren't happening that are indicating that your culture is not as trusting, right? And solid and positive as you think it might be. But there's a lot of indicators on how problems are solved, customer experience metrics, right? That will tell you we've got a problem. And the other thing is you might not have a problem everywhere, you might have a problem here in this part of the organization, and you might just need to dig a bit deeper because that division or department doesn't play well with others. Why is that? Right? Like you have a gap there. And it's not trying to solve the culture and saying everything's broken. It's saying we probably have some fine tuning in certain areas.
I don't know why this popped in my head. This was a client from years ago. I'm not going to say their name, but they were a printing industry. And so when we started working with them, you talk about looking at the metrics. And I remember there was a collaboration because they had some work going on in safety, because in their industry, that's, a huge thing. And I remember immediately expressing concerns because they had recently gone to 12-hour shifts, and I'm like, "Good for machines, not good for human beings," and kinda what was your rationale behind that? So that was, like, the first, like, is that the best decision?" And we were trying to help them with some culture and some well-being and some leadership and the whole shebang. And we did our culture survey initially, and there were these early warning signs. People were already a couple months in, complaining about fatigue, complaining about stress, worried about the 12-hour shifts. And there was also a lot of complaints around, we just call it Division X, this one area. And while there, at the time, their work comp claims were okay, Division X had the most like negative ratings in the culture survey, also had the most work comp injuries, also had the most leave of absence, right? And so we were trying to say, "Hey, what are you doing to develop the president of this division and kind of what's happening?" And they ignored it, ignored it, ignored it because at the time their work comp renewals were good, their experience modifier, and we weren't the safety people. We were just looking at that data along with ours and trying to help them put a picture together and say, "You guys, like,
All the
mm,
signs are pointing, whether they're culture
yeah,
indicators or not, they
yeah,
are,
they
right?
they
This is
they
that
100% are,
I
and so
love it.
then we did some work, but they wouldn't, like, they ignored us. It's the old parable of the frog in the boiling water. We were giving them, like, the frogs in room temperature water, and the temperature's going up, but you're ignoring us. And so we did some stuff over here and some stuff over here, and I kept being that, like, annoying squeaky wheel about Division X and that leader, and what did these do? And you fast forward, like, 3 years later, and they basically had to wait till that frog was in hot water and things were imploding. And guess what? They revoked the 12-hour shifts and went back to 8-hour shifts. They basically started to realize, because now their work comp renewals were awful. Now they were paying for it financially where they had a buffer for a couple of years. And now they're like, mandatory, get president of Division X into executive coaching to try to rehab him. And I'm like, that by itself is not going to fix the culture in his entire division that you've ignored for 3 years, and you haven't listened to your people, and they've been trying to tell you they're tired, and they've been, and so it's just such an example of like, y pay attention to the leading indicators and the subtle stuff before you're that frog in hot water, because it costs them a whole lot more, not just in, like, consultant fees, but in turnover and a whole bunch of other things and work comp and stuff because they didn't wanna listen to the more subtle data.
SHRM says that poor cultures cost US companies like $400 billion a year. But so much of it is indirect costs, right? Exactly what you just laid out. But the metrics don't lie. And this is the foundational thing that people need to break themselves up when they think about culture. Is that culture is a bunch of like turnover and HR metrics. Culture is everything you just talked about. Your safety metrics, your ops metrics, your all of those things are telling you whether you're healthy. So take the word culture out of it. Is it healthy? None of those metrics were healthy. Right? And so we have to start tying that back to what has been created and start having those conversations proactively, not when it's broken. Because even that leader going to them with these metrics to say, I think we've got some cultural misalignment, like let's get our culture locked in this team, is not a horrible conversation to have with him, her, whoever they were. Right. But then they waited and it was all
Yeah, and
there.
now it becomes 3 years later, you've been ignored as a leader, you haven't been developed, we haven't had the conversation, and now you're in the hot seat of, like, go and I get those clients, and I do them with our clients, but I'm always like, "I am not a magic wand, this person has to wanna do the work," but how defeating to be a executive or a leader of any kind and be like, "You're being forced into coaching now because you've screwed up," but part of it's, "We didn't have the conversation with you, and we didn't help you for 3 years, and now suddenly it's your fault," where it's like, "Well, yeah, that leader needs help, but you also failed that leader by not developing them, by not having the conversation, by all the."
And we
Yeah.
expect them to change when they're in the fire. We need to change them when things are okay, right? And can get better versus when the crisis happens is not when the leader's going to change, no matter how much coaching. It's just not, they're not in the right mindset for it.
Well, and 100% because you have that stress response and you have that hijack going on, and it's really hard to absorb anything because cognitively our brains are in protection mode. And the other thing that just came up for me as we're talking about culture is the old saying that's been around forever that you can't take a changed person and put them in an unchanged environment and expect something to be different. So we're gonna, oh, quick, go develop a leader, but we're not going to address the other cultural nuances that are surrounding that leader that are either enabling them to keep showing up in a way that isn't as effective as it could be or whatever it might be, or that person now gets enlightened and they come back but they're just hitting brick wall and roadblock after roadblock because they can't lead or influence the change that they want to see because there's other cultural issues at play. It wasn't just the leader's fault.
Start having these types of conversations in your organization, in your team, and see the magic that can happen if you start doing that.
Well, and one of the things when I think about a starting point, now this is a caveat, and you talk about this in your book, that the organizations have to have done the work to actually have a clear, articulated purpose that people understand and take their values from these gauzy, whatever, to something that's clear and operationalized. But assuming that work has been done, what I tell individual leaders to do is just start in your next one on one, in your next team meeting. Pull out the organization's values and purpose and just have a conversation about where are we seeing this in action and lived and what's the impact? Where are we seeing a misstep or misalignment? And just to your point, just have a dialogue. That in and of itself, you don't have to hire anybody. You just have the conversation.
Right, and we go so I talk about culture vision. It's a two-page document for free, cultureclimb.com. We were very adamant with this book about giving tools away because we're boutique consulting firms. Like I'm not going to solve this for every company on the planet. I wrote the book so that they can do it themselves, right? Kind of self implement. And even taking that, and if you are the engineering team in an organization, your culture vision statement might be different than if you're the project management or you're the sales team. That's okay, right? You're coming up with words and how we want to interact with each other. And right, just going through that exercise alone will fundamentally start to shift, right? Your team's culture. And again, control your own backyard first instead of pointing to everybody else and saying, I need them to all be better. You be better, and you will influence everyone else because everyone's going to want to work for you. If you're a leader that's doing this kind of stuff, everyone's going to want to work for you. Other leaders are going to be like, "What are you doing? Because your team's producing results like different than my team." Right? Influence people by the actions that you're doing instead of worrying about everybody else.
Take care of your own backyard. Like I think you're right. Like that's what we can do. And I think that there's not a caveat, but I think it's a yes and in that what I've also seen is where leaders, again, well intended, are trying to take care of their own backyard or their own team, but then they're not doing it under the umbrella of alignment and connection to the broader organization strategy or team. So then what happens is it's like turf protecting, and they're like, well, I'm taking care of my team, but it's at the detriment of being able to collaborate or the detriment of being able to truly effectively serve the organization's vision and purpose and values. So I think that just came to mind that there's like a little caveat there that got to be very like, yes, you need to take care of your own backyard, and it's not a either or, it's a both and. That cannot be at the detriment of not collaborating, not collectively working towards a shared vision.
Right. Yeah. That's a very good because it's a spectrum, right? It can go a negative or a positive can become a negative if it's too far isolated, if you isolate yourself.
And so, question that I'm curious, because you and I also geek out about leadership as well as culture, clearly. But in this day and age, since the last time we talked on my podcast, you know, boatload has happened. This is just a crazy environment that just keeps getting more and more disruptive and more divisive, and just the list goes on and on. What are you seeing in your work and with your clients is the biggest course correction that we need right now from a leadership standpoint, do you think?
What we're seeing is what we're calling restlessness. And it's happening on the employee side and on the leader side. And it's causing issues in organizations that don't need to be there, right? But it's getting worse and worse and worse. And you're seeing it right on the divide of like the labor statistics and the layoffs and the like. There's just like a lot of news right around this, and we're calling it restlessness. But I think the biggest thing right now is leaders. I'm just going to talk to the leaders that are listening because I think if we can impact them, they can impact their teams. But the leaders that are listening that have, meaning everyone's a leader, but that have other people under their care is how I would right describe that, is they have got to figure out how to manage their own energy, their own positive intelligence, right? There's words around like the aura, the energy that you carry into a room based on what's going on in your head, in your body before you came into the office. Leaders have got to figure out how to take care of themselves because their oxygen masks aren't on right now and they're trying to take care of everybody else and it's not doing anybody any good. And I think we're turning a corner though. I have so much hope because we're talking about mental health, we're talking about burnout, and we're giving people permission to say, I'm not great right now. I'm not in a great place. Then we've got to support them in how to get there.
So many people have a narrative that self-care is somehow selfish. But to your point, if I'm fried, I'm not good to everybody. And we hear about compassion fatigue and excess empathy and whatever other terms you want to put at it, but if we're not whole, whatever that means for us, mentally, physically, spiritually, whatever, if we're not whole, people who have that formal leadership title, in this case, you're talking about CEOs, they are a person who happens to have this role that happens to be really stressful. Like,
But they're
yeah,
a human
yeah,
first.
they're a human first, leader second. Yes, 100%. So, speaking of being human, one of the things that I'm obsessed with is normalizing the messiness of being human, and that as humans, we are all hardwired to tell ourselves stories that keep us safe and small. What is a self-limiting story that you still tell yourself sometimes? And when it shows up, how do you move beyond it so that you can still show up as a leader and have that influential power and have the impact you want to have in your life?
I have so many. How do I choose just one? My therapist can tell you I have so many. Um, let's see, what's one I'm working on right now? So I think the self-limiting thought right now is that I'm not enough. And that means for my family, for my team, am I doing everything I need to do? And am I right? Am I good enough kind of thing? Which surprisingly, I run into a lot of leaders have that. And it's what has given me my drive to just succeed, right? And excel and do everything, run at 150 miles an hour. But in this season of my life right now, it's not serving me. It served me when I needed to build the business to a certain level and the business is thriving and I'm like, "Well, what's next?" And maybe I'm not good enough to do that or I'm not good enough to take the business to the next level or whatever it is. So that's something I'm dealing with right now and trying to work through because I think again, you hit it at every level. entry-level employee and CEO. If they're honest with us, they're both having that thought. It's just manifesting in a different way. And so I'm working through how do I make sure I'm validated in some way and I feel like what I'm doing is enough.
I love that simply because it is so common and is so human. And the other thing I love that you said, Jamie, that is something that I try to reinforce with people is those stories that we have, including the not enough story. We have to recognize there are gifts in that story because they served us well to a point, right? You like the drive, and I'm gonna prove people wrong. Where like there's a benefit and a gift you get from that story, and you hit a point, which I love that you're looking at this now of, and it's not serving me anymore. So I've got to reconcile the story and replace it with I need a new
I need a
story.
new story. Yes.
All right, are you ready for quick questions? Some are the same, some might have changed, but we're gonna do it. Last time you had to dance, you don't have to dance this
Okay.
time, so that's okay. Okay. So fill in the blank. Living authentically is
Peaceful. Just being able to show up in who I am and not make apologies for it.
when the world is presenting an opening, but you don't feel like showing up as a leader. What do you do?
I elevate someone around me to fill the gap. If I'm not showing up and I don't have energy for it, somebody else on my team probably does.
All right, what are you grateful for right now?
Right in this moment, I'm grateful for you and I'm grateful for our friendship and the fact that to the outside world, you and I could look like competitors, but we both know that we have a dent that we're supposed to make and right, we're supposed to drive change and we're a lot stronger together. So I'm really grateful for you, but I'm grateful for those people in my life that don't see competition, they see abundance and they see a different message that we're supposed to be sharing together.
Oh, love it. Right back at you. Yeah, there is so much work to be done. So here we go. So, okay, closing question. Jamie, if you could challenge leaders everywhere to practice this one behavior that would create more human workplaces and equip everyone to show up as a leader, what would that be?
I want every leader to learn how to lead themselves first. And I think if we can teach them to lead themselves in good times and in bad, better, meaning their energy, everything we talked about, then leading people and leading culture becomes a lot easier.
I'm Rosie Ward, and this is Show Up as a Leader. To learn more, head over to peopleforwardnetwork.com and, of course, hit that follow button.